My name is Steve Zach, and I'm chair of the ROLI initiative for the American Bar. On behalf of the board, the staff, all our volunteers, which are continuing to grow in number, we welcome you to the annual Rule of Law Conference. We convene this conference every year at about this time so that we can all get together and we can think about what we've done during the year and take stock of the good ideas, sometimes the bad ideas, and most certainly the progress we have made and should make going forward. The lessons we've learned, again, sometimes the hard way. But this is a unique year. As important as these meetings are every year, this year is the 25th anniversary of ROLI. And it is hard to imagine what the founders of ROLI actually would have thought of this meeting. You had Sandy Dalembert, you had Mark Ellis, Homer, which I think Homer's around somewhere, or will be, sitting together and thinking to themselves, you know, there's an opportunity out there. We're going to we'll do a little training, maybe show a video. There's no technology really available whatsoever. You know, maybe write a constitution or two, and the world's going to be a better place. There'll be nothing left for us to do, and we're all going to go home. Well, you know, man plans and God laughs. The fact is that the world has changed incredibly, and not for the better in many instances. The world today is a more dangerous place than ever. The rule of law is threatened in more places than ever. The importance of the rule of law is questioned as never before. And you know that more than ever, the rule of law has to be protected and promoted. It's very interesting that the UN is now looking at their post-2015 development goals. And they are now considering rule of law. It's interesting it took them this long, but the rule of law is a major component of the ability of countries to develop. And no one, this is just common sense, frankly, when you think about it, no multinational or individual is going to go into a country that does not respect the rule of law. They would have no opportunity to repatriate whatever they've spent in those countries. They would be in danger from the court system. That would not be one that they could rely on to mete out justice. So for so many reasons, this meeting is special, and you being here is particularly special to us. We're going to have a meeting at the end of June. I think it's 27th, 28th, and 29th in Prague. And we're going to bring together all the alumni, kind of a scary thought, but we are very excited about that meeting because we really need to reflect on what the last 25 years has been, but more importantly, what the next 25 years will be. And of course, when this was set up 25 years ago, the concept, and we're going to have a meeting that's going to be, I guess it's Skype, is going to be the way we're going to transmit it around the world to all of you. Obviously, that was the last thing on their mind, but we have so many opportunities to do more with the technology advantages we have today. At the end of the day, the most important thing we can say is we appreciate you. We salute you, and we know that we're only as good as each and every one of you is. I recently came back from Morocco with Omar, who was sitting in the front row there, who was our country director, and we had 3 days of very intensive visits from the judiciary and all civil sectors. They have a new constitution. But as we were leaving, the ambassador, he said, and we're always asking for money, you know that. So we have all these programs we want to expand, and he looked at me and he said, as long as Omar is spending the money, you can have whatever you want. That's the kind of people that you are, and that's why you're so important to the future of the rule of law. We welcome you, and we look forward to having an opportunity to speak with you. And now you have a special opportunity to listen to an amazing woman. That's the only way to describe Betsy Anderson. She has brought so much passion, so much energy to ROLI in such a short period of time that in many ways you can barely recognize that it's the same group of people. And we're so fortunate to have her as our executive director and delighted that we can listen to her now.
Thank you very much, Steve, for that nice introduction. And maybe as I'm speaking and introducing our speaker, those of you particularly in that awkward place behind the pillar can come forward and take some of these seats in the front. Don't be shy, please. Homer, I see you. Come on, lead the crowd. You led us 25 years ago. You can lead folks up here so that you get a better view. I want to join Steve in welcoming you all, especially members of our board and the ABA leadership that are here. Appreciate you all. Maybe our board members could stand, those of you who are in the front here and everywhere, so everyone can put faces with names. It's my special pleasure to introduce today's keynote, Tom Malinowski, Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Rights, and Labor, and a longtime friend of mine. Tom has worked tirelessly for almost 25 years inside and outside of government to advance human rights as a core principle of U.S. foreign policy. First in the Clinton administration as a speechwriter and member of the policy planning staff, and then as senior director at the National Security staff at the White House. He then spent 12 years at Human Rights Watch as its extraordinarily effective director of advocacy here in Washington. And that's where I had the pleasure of working with Tom for a couple of years, and I learned everything I know about effective advocacy by trailing this guy to meetings around town. And of course now he is the lead State Department diplomat for our cause, for advancing rights and rule of law around the world. His one-year anniversary was just about 10 days ago. And it's really very exciting to see him in this role and to experience his leadership. I can think of no one better situated to begin our anniversary reflections this afternoon and help us cast an eye back over 25 years to appreciate where we've been and where we're headed in the struggle for rights and rule of law. Please join me in welcoming Assistant Secretary Malinowski.
Very nice.
Thank you so much, Betsy. It is great to see you, as always, and that was a nice introduction. There was one bald-faced lie, and that's when you suggested that I worked tirelessly. There was actually a really great blog post posted by a supporter of the former regime in Sri Lanka about me last week after we were there on a wonderful, wonderful trip. And after detailing all of America's sins and all of my sins, the headline was, "Tom Malinowski should go to sleep." I was like, yeah, I should. I really would like to get some sleep. Thank you. Anyway, there was a time, and it doesn't feel like long ago, when Betsy and I, as she mentioned, were partners in crime at Human Rights Watch, or as we like to think of it, partners in crime fighting. We get our paychecks from different institutions today, but we are still partners. It seems like wherever I go in the world, staying long enough to admire a problem, I find myself wishing that you guys, some of Betsy's rule of law brigades, could go and stay behind to actually solve the problem. As we meet here, thanks to the ABA's Rule of Law Initiative, lawyers in Libya are learning about legal ethics. Syrian refugees in Turkey are getting access to legal services. Russians are gaining new tools to fight corruption. Civil society groups in the Central African Republic are taking part in reforming their country's constitution. Now, it's all wonderful work. It ought to make us happy to think about it. But I mentioned those 4 countries in particular for a reason, and it's not a happy one. I did so because these are all places from which little good news is coming today. I mention them precisely because they challenge our faith in the work of rule of law promoters and human rights advocates, that we can work together to make a better world. I've been in this job for over a year now, and when old friends see me scanning the headlines from Syria to Libya to Yemen, and they say, "So how's it going?" And I usually reply something like, we're just tying up a few loose ends here and there. But in all seriousness, it is very easy to think about all those headlines and feel like my first mentor in Washington, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, used to say that the world breaks your heart sometimes. So what I'd like to do with that beginning is to offer a little bit of perspective on the troubling events of the day, plus an argument for hope and continued commitment. First, the perspective. Consider these headlines from the New York Times. Syria set to raise part of rebel city. Syrian forces set to gain upper hand in battle against dissidents. Mideast struggle over Yemen. Yemen Republicans charge Saudi raid. Sound familiar, I assume. The first 2 are from 1982, when Bashar Assad's father razed a city controlled by opponents of his rule. The second 2 are from a period in the mid-1960s when Saudi and Egyptian forces intervened in a civil war in Yemen. Now, the main point I want to make with those examples is not that there's nothing unique about the problems of our present day, although that's true. It's rather this, that if you were to look at the editorial pages of the Times from when those articles were written, I'm certain that you would not have found a single commentary urging the administrations of the day to go in and take action and save lives and help people secure their rights and liberties and freedoms, or to help build institutions as you do to try to prevent such things from happening. We were no less powerful and rich back then, but such things were just not seen as our responsibility. I mentioned the Central African Republic a few moments ago. Last year, as a Christmas present for my mom, I ordered a bound set of all the Newsweek magazines from 1972, which was the first year that we spent in America after we came here from Poland. And one little article in particular caught my eye. It was a piece about how Emperor Bokassa of the Central African Republic had gathered all of the suspected criminals in his capital to a soccer stadium, whereupon in front of assembled diplomats and dignitaries and journalists, he ordered his troops to beat them all until many of them were dead. Now, Newsweek in 1972, they assumed that their readers would be interested in this story, but there was not the slightest implication in the article that such events created any foreign policy dilemma for the United States, that we had any reason to do anything about them. This was a curiosity. It was not a call to action. 40 years later, there is still turmoil in the Central African Republic, but we have responded by supporting a multidimensional UN mission with over 10,000 troops, a political effort. We have a special envoy in the State Department dedicated solely to the Central African Republic. And we haven't solved the problem, but we have saved lives. And these efforts, I think, reflect a radical change in how we relate to the rest of the world. We feel more connected to faraway peoples and events, and a greater sense of responsibility to worry about and to right wrongs over which we would have lost no sleep a generation or 2 ago. And I think that's a very good thing. But it's also the main reason why we feel the heartbreak we do today when people working for human rights around the world experience setbacks. Now, it doesn't by itself explain why those setbacks continue to happen. So here, let me suggest a few basic propositions. First, there is a high-stakes contest of ideas in the world, In fact, it's been around for quite a long time. As President Obama has said, throughout human history, societies have grappled with fundamental questions of how to organize themselves, the proper relationship between the individual and the state. Some of us hold fast to the belief that through conscience and free will, each of us has the right to live as we choose. The belief that power is derived from the consent of the governed, that laws and institutions should be established to protect that understanding. But those ideals, the President added, have often been threatened by an older, more traditional view of power. The alternative vision argues that ordinary men and women are too small-minded to guide their own affairs, that order and progress can only come when individuals surrender their rights to an all-powerful sovereign. The contest, in other words, is and always has been between those who think that states exist to serve their citizens and those who think that citizens exist to serve their states. Second, and here's the hopeful part, in this contest, I think that ordinary citizens around the world are more empowered today than they ever have been at any previous point in history. They're more empowered because the human rights movement has succeeded in establishing as a basic international norm that everyone really does have the right to speak, to associate, to worship freely, and to choose their leaders in free elections. In other words, it can no longer be said to be legitimate to deny these rights, and any leader who does so loses legitimacy in any country, in any culture. Citizens are also more empowered because they're more connected to each other. Civil society in one country now helps civil society in every other country. Citizens are more empowered because information and ideas can no longer be contained, because cheap software can defeat the most expensive firewall, because almost everyone in every part of the world knows how people live everywhere else, enough to see through the lies that dictators tell to keep their subjects happy. So a democracy movement in Tunisia can raise expectations throughout the entire Arab world. Ukrainians confronting abuse of power can inspire Russians fed up with the same thing, as Vladimir Putin clearly understands. People in China can see Burmese, Indonesians, even people in Taiwan electing their leaders and ask, why not us? Look at how ordinary people in Iran right now are cheering the nuclear deal, or the prospect of a nuclear deal with the United States, not just because they would rather not live under sanctions, but because they want to be connected to us and the world. Look at Cuba. For years, cool kids in America put up posters of Che Guevara on their walls as a sort of shallow revolutionary statement. Now, cool kids in Cuba are wearing American flags on their t-shirts and jeans and bandanas, a revolutionary statement of a very different sort. And this can happen everywhere. In North Korea, even in North Korea, smartphones are appearing as status symbols, and all people need is a data card or a flash drive to hold in their hands an encyclopedia of knowledge about the world, with some South Korean soap operas thrown in for good measure. Why can't we live like that, people say? And now, for the very first time, the North Korean regime appears sensitive to human rights criticism from around the world. This universal aspiration to be treated with fairness and dignity, and the universal appeal of democracy as the way to achieve those values, I think is particularly evident on those magical days when people are given the power to vote for their leaders. And I have to be honest here, we are sometimes in the State Department very anxious on the day before elections in divided and unstable societies. We worry that they may lead to violence, that they may exacerbate political or sectarian divisions, and then we are repeatedly surprised by what ordinary people can do on that one day when power belongs to them. Consider Afghanistan, which many people consider a feudal society where much of the population is living in another age, and yet where in the midst of a bloody conflict, millions of people voted last year, not for warlords or for traditional power brokers, but for the two leaders among the many who are running for president in that country who had the most progressive vision of their country's future. Look at the election last month in Nigeria, where voters defied legitimate fears of violence and rigging and showed that the people of Africa's biggest country could change their government peacefully and where their will was respected. Look at Sri Lanka, where in January voters defied everybody's expectations and replaced a government that had undermined their country's democracy with one committed to reconciliation and the rule of law. I was in Sri Lanka, as I mentioned, a couple of weeks ago, and at one point we went to visit with some fishermen who had just been given back land that the government had seized from them years ago. These men had still no livelihoods. They had no homes. They seemed beaten down and persecuted in every possible way. And then I asked them about elections. And they said with perfect confidence, we voted for the current government because they promised to give us back our land. We will support it if it keeps its promises. Otherwise, we will boot it out. These guys had nothing in the way of material things or political connections, but they knew their power. It was absolutely inspiring. And this leads me to my third point. It is precisely because their citizens are more empowered today that so many authoritarian governments are pushing back so ruthlessly, especially against civil society groups and their connections to us, to the outside world, to you. They're doing so not because they're more emboldened, but because they are more threatened. Now, I don't want to put a positive spin on this problem. In the short run, it's very dangerous. It has led some authoritarian governments not just to crush internal dissent, but to intervene outside their borders with cyber tools and with old-fashioned military tools to stop the example of democracy from spreading. As their old conception of power loses legitimacy, some of them are going back to older ideas of nationalism and territorial expansion. So it's gone in Russia with respect to Ukraine. But in the longer run, people fighting for human rights and human dignity around the world, I think, still have tremendous advantages, especially if we continue to stand with them. And we will, and we'll do so in part because it reinforces every core national security interest we have, even in the toughest cases. At bottom, I think that human rights, the values that we promote, are a set of rules that define the relationship between people and their governments in a way that squares with the natural demands of human dignity. When those rules break down, we know the result is often conflict and crisis that threatens our security. Look at Syria. A dictator tries to crush a movement for democratic freedoms, creating a gateway for extremists alongside a pile of corpses, and we have ISIL as a result. Look at Russia. An increasingly authoritarian government fears a democracy movement at home, then sees another rise next door. And what is the result? The first major land grab in Europe since World War II. So, to sum up, there's always been a contest in the world between citizens seeking freedom and opportunity and forces of an older, more authoritarian order. The good guys in that contest are more empowered than ever before. This has led to an authoritarian backlash with often tragic consequences, and we, the United States, have a stake in shaping the outcome of that context. But this leads to one more question, and that is, do we have the ability to shape the outcome anymore? Some people would argue that we no longer have, perhaps not the ability, but the credibility to champion human rights and democracy around the world because we have sometimes failed to exemplify those values at home by allowing torture after 9/11 or because of allegations of police brutality in the United States, for example. As someone whose job it is to advance these democratic values around the world, I can attest how vital it is for America to set a good example. I thank everybody in this room who champions civil rights and civil liberties in the United States, including in the fight against terrorism. President Obama's actions to ensure lawful interrogations and to be open about our past mistakes, I think have helped us tremendously around the world. I feel it on every trip I go on. Some people worried, including in our administration, that the release of the Senate report on the CIA's interrogation program would hurt our credibility around the world. I think the opposite has been true. Last month, President Ashraf Ghani of Afghanistan was here in Washington. He came to a dinner at the State Department, and when he saw Senator Dianne Feinstein, who was the author of that report, in the audience, he thanked her for issuing it, and he said, quote, "It took immense courage, Dianne, to reveal what was wrong, and I hope that our government in Afghanistan can follow your example. Where there are abuses, we must acknowledge and put an end to it, because without that capacity for self-examination, a free society can never thrive." So that capacity for self-examination, for confronting our own problems, it enables us to say to the world what President Obama said last week in Panama. America, he said, never makes a claim about being perfect. We do make a claim about being open to change. That is what we showcase and promote around the world, not the absence of injustice, but a set of institutions that enable people to confront injustice. Now, we will still get pushback when we do so, but I'll tell you this. I've been in this job, in my last job, to plenty of refugee camps and bombed out cities and meetings of human rights activists who are threatened in repressive countries. And occasionally I've been told, you know, you Americans ought to hurry up. Even in those places, I've been told, hurry up and close Guantanamo. Or, you know, I've been asked about Ferguson. I've been grilled about the NSA. But I have never had a single person tell me, until you address those concerns, you don't have a right to save us from barrel bombs. You don't have a right to help us stay out of prison or to advocate for better courts or schools or health care for our communities. And you know, I've never heard anyone, well, the thing that people are angry at us about in those places is generally that we're not doing enough to help them. And I've never heard that particular anger in those places directed at China or Russia or France or Germany or Brazil or India or anybody else. No one is upset at them for not riding to the rescue. It's always us. Here's what a Christian bishop in northern Iraq said to me a short while ago. Quote, "We only trust America and God now." I said to him, look, you're a Christian bishop. You should know the difference between America and God. And I told him that, you know, this is slightly exaggerated as a view of American power and so on and so on. But you know what? If you're a Christian in Iraq or Syria or any other civilian with ISIL bearing down on you, you're not going to have much time for the notion that America is in decline, or that we don't have a right to interfere. These folks have seen what we can do, and it is totally rational for them to look to us and only to us for help. We can't be there for everyone, in all places, at all times. But when we bear down with patience and commitment, I think we have made and can make a big difference. I've mentioned Sri Lanka. It's one place where we did advocate consistently for democratic values, demanding accountability for human rights abuses, withholding assistance from the government, mobilizing the international community through the UN. We didn't use our coercive power. All we had was our voice, amplified by UN resolutions. But in this way, we were able to wield one of the most important currencies we have, the ability to confer or deny legitimacy. Another country where we doubled down on promoting democracy recently was Burma. We did so for almost 20 years with a coherent strategy, applying economic and political pressure to the military junta there, while telling it we'd be willing to relax that pressure so long as there was a dialogue with the democratic opposition in that country, and that opposition came to us to say, it's working. We thus took our immense leverage, we transferred it to the democratic forces in Burma, giving them the power to bargain on their own behalf, and they have done so. Now, these two examples are interesting in one other way. When we were applying this pressure, there was not a shred of evidence that it was working. Many people thought our efforts were hopeless, that we were simply pushing these countries into the hands of Russia or China. And this is partly because the leaders of authoritarian countries always push back, invariably. They push back hard when we press them on issues of democracy and the rule of law. Funnily enough, they never say to us, you know, that pressure you're applying to us, it's really giving us second thoughts. You know, we're really thinking about changing our policies. Maybe if you keep it up a little longer, we will. No, on the contrary. What we saw in these cases and in many others is that promoting this cause, it's like taking a sledgehammer to a really big stone wall. You know, you have the first blow against the wall will create some sparks, but it'll make no difference, no apparent difference. Neither will the second, neither will the third, neither will the fifth, neither will the 100th. But over time, you're undermining the foundations of that stone wall, and eventually you strike a blow and the whole thing crumbles, and you wonder, wow, how did that happen? And then you realize that actually you had something to do with it. All of this is to say we have very strong tools in this fight. Some of them are wielded by our government, some of them are wielded by organizations like yours. If we use them wisely, progress will still be slow, there will still be setbacks, there will still be heartbreaks, but that's been true for every worthwhile goal, not just human rights goals that we have promoted in our foreign policy over the years. Think about the decades of American leadership from World War II to the Cold War to the present. What has worked? What has worked best for us? I'd say we've succeeded when we have patiently tried to do the right thing, when we have stood up with persistence and with fairness for our values and the friends who share them, promoting global norms based on those values, building institutions and alliances to enforce them, and confronting, where necessary, those who threaten them. That strategy takes time and perseverance, but it has worked. We've stumbled when we've lost faith in it, when we've erred on the side of rash actions inconsistent with our values, or simply given up on our ability to do anything. I'd say it's never a mistake to align ourselves with people who struggle for the kind of world that we want to live in. The mistake we sometimes make is imagining that helping them win can be the work of a few news cycles or a few grants to the ABA, or even a single presidential administration, or to forget that some of the goals that we promote, which seem so benign to us, like promoting civil society and transparency and open government, those goals can be deadly threatening to entrenched structures of power in some parts of the world. Of course, when such power is threatened, it will fight back, causing conflict and sometimes presenting us with tough short-term choices. But when tyrants and kleptocrats push back against something, perhaps we ought to consider that that something is probably worth supporting. It's probably something that can work if we stick with it. And that knowledge ought to give us something that I think we need a little bit more of right now, and which will be the final word that I leave you with. That something is confidence. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you very much, Tom. I think we have about 15 minutes or so for questions from the audience and discussion. Are there questions? I think we have a handheld mic coming up. While folks are thinking about the question they want to pose, maybe I can begin. Tom, when I think about the last 25 years and I think about the rule of law and human rights movement and what have been some of the key developments, I can't help but think about the advent of individual criminal responsibility. The ad hoc tribunals, International Criminal Court, domestic accountability, it's been a huge part of the ABA's work over the years. And I wonder if you can evaluate that and as a tool of change, and where you see that movement going for the future.
Well, I think it's been a sea change. It's one of the normative changes that I mentioned in my remarks, that it is now conceivable that leaders of countries, leaders of militaries could someday be held accountable, and some have, even though it's very difficult to get there. And I think that does change minds. I think it does make such leaders think twice. It is, of all the goals we promote, and we do push it in a lot of places, probably the hardest goal we promote, because, you know, when you're talking to a foreign government leader, There's some things that it's possible to persuade that person to do. It's rarely easy to persuade that person to go to jail or to, subject him or herself to a process that could lead ultimately to going to jail. And yet, I mentioned, I talked a lot about Sri Lanka in my remarks, and there, the goal that we were pressing relentlessly following the end of the civil war in that country in 2009, a civil war that had to be fought but ended very badly with a lot of terrible atrocities committed by both sides. The value we were pressing was accountability. And, I remember, and I was back in HRW, I was thinking this at the time, that we were very unlikely to get accountability in the short run. But by pressing it, we were, number one, denying that government the myth of the good war that it was using to try to sustain its legitimacy. They were basically arguing, we crushed this terrorist movement, and we made no mistakes, and it was all perfect, and therefore we are the legitimate leaders of this country. But by pressing accountability for serious allegations of war crimes, we were undermining that narrative. And by demanding that they do the thing that was the most difficult for them to do, we actually sometimes made it easier to get them to do things that were less difficult, like releasing IDPs from camps and not shutting down a newspaper, or things that were less existential for them, because they felt this pressure to subject themselves to the one thing that they could not allow. War crimes trials for us, we can't allow that. So let's give the internationals something else, and we actually got some other things by pressing the accountability agenda. So it is a very big change. It is part of our discourse. It is very difficult, but we either get accountability in the long term, I hope, or in the short term, it may help us achieve other goals.
Mr. Secretary, can you actually protect human rights without a foundation of the rule of law? Can they exist in two different orbits, or to have any real human rights protection, you have to have the rule of law foundation?
I love those philosophical questions.
I'm glad I don't have to answer them.
My answer would simply be no, you can't.
So what do we do with countries, and take Cuba for example, and the human rights issues involving Cuba that at some point in time have to be discussed, and the rule of law issues also which are being discussed? How do you reconcile those different concerns so that you end up protecting human rights?
Yeah. In the short term, and this getting back to your first question, and Cuba's a good example of this, you can get people out of prison without the rule of law. And oftentimes the way we get people out of prison is by telling leaders to ignore the independence of the judiciary, right? We say, just get them out of prison. And then they say, but we have an independent judiciary. And then we say, come on, we know you don't. Just get them out of prison. And,
Mr. Gross found that out.
So, as part, as you guys know, following the historic change in our policy towards Cuba, that one of the elements of the diplomatic process that we underwent with Cuba this year was a decision by the Cuban government, I will emphasize, to release several dozen political prisoners on a list that we had given them. That was not a rule of law decision. That was an executive decision to get people out of prison. We're happy that they're out of prison. But until there is truly an independent judiciary enforcing a constitution that guarantees human rights in Cuba in a reliable way, more people are going to be arrested, and we're going to be called upon again and again and again to urge their release. And so, yeah, in the short term, we try to save people's lives. We try to get them out of prison. We try to stop NGOs from getting shut down, and so on and so on. But in the longer term, none of those gains are secure if we can't encourage successfully the establishment of rule of law institutions. So,
thank you.
Yep.
Questions? Yes.
I guess this is on, okay. What are the State Department's strategies in transition countries for educating the next generation of young people who will be their citizens in rule of law issues and creating a culture of rule of law and democracy?
Well, we send ABA Sealy, ROLI, sorry. Is that dated? Why is that in my head?
It's included.
It shows how long our partnership has been, right? Well, that's only half in jest, but it is part of the answer, is that we partner with organizations like yours to make those connections and to do them in a, and to engage in a more sustained way than, diplomats who are running around the world with no attention span can do. We also ask Congress to preserve funding for our exchange programs and visitor programs, which are profoundly important. You really realize this as you meet folks around the world who have taken part in these programs and have had the experience of coming here and just experiencing life with us for a few days, a few weeks, a few months. And the struggle just to maintain resources for these programs, which aren't very sexy and which don't respond to a particular crisis or need like Ebola, but that allow us to sustain our engagement with civil society in country after country. It's been very, very difficult, but it's absolutely essential. So if any of you are going up to the Hill anytime soon, please remind them of the importance of those programs.
Well, on that point, we have ABA Day occurring right now in Washington. I'm sure whether you're familiar, we bring up about 500 lawyers every year to go through to every delegation, House and Senate, of local people that they rely on for their political positions to talk about these issues, including the one you just mentioned. And if anyone wants to be involved in that in any way in the future, let us know and we'll get you involved.
Tom, I'm going to pose a question to you that one of our country directors posed to me yesterday. She was describing work that we have done in the Middle East, rights advocacy, education of women about their rights, focused particularly on victims of domestic violence, and educating them about the ability that they would have to escape a violent relationship, that they could do so and retain custody of their children. And she described the frustration that she had felt in this program. It had been transformative in many ways in terms of opening people's eyes to their legal possibilities, but in many cases, realizing those rights was beyond their reach because of the economic realities, that they could gain custody of their children but actually never be able to support them. And it poses a real challenge to us to think about the relationship between rights, economic rights and political and civil rights, and about integration of these two parts of our effort, the Millennium Development Goals or the post-2015 development goals and integration through that effort. I wonder what your thoughts are about how the U.S. government can help us achieve that.
That's a pretty big question. I'm going to punt when it comes to how we can end poverty in the world, because ultimately that's what you're getting at. I will say that many of us who've worked on these issues over the years, we think about human rights in terms of the political dissidents and the human rights groups around the world and people who are campaigning for democracy and trying to gain the right to change their leaders. And it's kind of a political stratum that is demanding rights for a particular purpose. And whether it's Lech Wałęsa or Andrei Sakharov or Aung San Suu Kyi, those are the faces of the movement that we think about when that we are conscious of supporting around the world. And yet, I think for the vast majority of ordinary people don't experience human rights in the way that Aung San Suu Kyi experienced human rights. For them, it is trying to get through their day without having to pay a bribe to a cop on the street. It's about being able to interact with government offices and being treated with dignity. It's the fruit seller in Tunisia who just got tired of getting slapped around. Wasn't a political person, but that was the issue for that person and for millions of others. And among these issues, I think the ability to gain access to justice for not political reasons, but for reasons like domestic violence, for example, or corruption, or kind of the normal day-to-day things, land disputes that people in any society rely on the legal system to help resolve. It is the absence of that I think for most people around the world constitutes the greatest human rights abuse. And yes, it is partly an economic issue, which is way beyond my capacity to think about what the solution ought to be. But I do believe, and we have talked about this in my bureau, that making access to justice a more central part of the global human rights agenda and the global development agenda, including through the development goals, is something that we ought to be doing. And I know you guys do. I mean, some of your programs involve basically access to justice for poor people in many countries around the world. And if there's one thing that we help fund in my bureau and the U.S. government that we could probably increase by 100-fold and still barely tap the need around the world, I think it would be that. So we are thinking about it. You guys should be lobbying us to do more of it because I think it addresses a absolutely critical need that we haven't been thinking about enough in this movement.
You know, to put a gloss on what Betsy's question was getting at, we're not going to solve the economic problems of the world, that's for sure. But at a more basic
Somebody
level,
should, though.
well, I hope you have a big check. But I don't think that we're going to foot that bill as a country, at least no time soon. However, the bigger problem is the cultural gap, because we look at these problems from a Western, maybe particularly United States viewpoint. When I was recently in Morocco that I mentioned, in that country, women cannot work. So we went to a shelter, Omar and I, where there were surprisingly about 1,000 files, a little more, all pro bono assistance. We had a woman who was stabbed 65 times by her husband. It was horrific. Something that I'd like to forget and never have known. But when it came down to it, she said, what am I going to do? I can't put him in jail, because if I put him in jail, then my children and myself and everyone else around us are going to starve to death. So we're trying to fix a problem without an ultimate solution when we don't look through the culture of the country that we're dealing with. And, you know, how do we do that? I mean, writing a check is actually easier than dealing with culture.
We can't do that.
We can't.
The only people who can do that are organized, committed voices working within their societies who speak the language, and I don't mean the language linguistically, but culturally, politically, of their country. It's true in the United States, right? I mean, we wouldn't have made the progress in LGBT rights that we have made if people hadn't found a distinctly American political narrative to explain why that was important.
Right.
So it has to come from within, but what we can do is champion the rights of those people, of those activists, of those civil society organizations, to be able to do what they do, to have the space to do what they do without having to worry about getting thrown in prison or kicked out of their country, which then gets back to the core rights that we are all in the business of promoting.
I saw Jim Silkenut. Jim, you are actively involved in the World Justice Project, former president of the American Bar Association, and on the ROLI board. You know, you just did a report about access in the United States as compared to other places in the world. I don't remember the exact numbers, but we were way down, maybe 29 out of 95 or something like that, 65. You know, we get that thrown back at us a lot, that, you want access here, but you don't provide access to your own country. How do you deal with those type of questions through the World Justice Project, your efforts there?
Part of it's educating legislators here about the problems they've caused by not taking appropriate spending actions. The question I had, though, was in a slightly different context, and that's the International Criminal Court. It looks like now that because of various political considerations, the status quo is, at least in terms of U.S. membership, is all that's anybody's going to pursue. Yet when we talk with foreigners about this, the lack of U.S. membership on the International Criminal Court keeps coming up. I'm curious if there's something in this debate or a failure to have a debate at the moment that we've missed.
I actually haven't heard that much myself. I hear other complaints, but not that one. I think we've gotten to a fairly good place with the ICC in the sense that we are supporting its work in many parts of the world. We champion it. There's no hostility or conflict between us and the court. The bigger challenge that the court has, frankly, politically, is in Africa, where despite strong African support for the ICC initially and moving cases to The Hague on African initiative, there is now a perception on the continent that there have been too many African cases, and there we are seen as aggressive champions of the ICC.
Even though we're not willing to subject ourselves to.
Even though we're not, I just don't. It's a perfectly legitimate point for people to make. I just objectively, I haven't heard it as much recently because there is a perception that I think we moved from aggressive hostility towards the ICC to a posture of cooperation on a case-by-case basis. And where we go politically on the ICC domestically in our own debate is anybody's guess. But I think we've gotten to a relatively good place. I'm seeing the signs.
We want to thank the Secretary. He's got an incredibly busy schedule that he managed to squeeze us in. Your remarks have been extremely informative. We appreciate your attendance here. More importantly, we appreciate the life you've lived in supporting human rights. So let us give him our appreciation.
Thank you, everyone.